what does it mean to identify oneself, one's people, one's nation as chosen? To be uniquely chosen is to be chosen for some salvific purpose, and this means that all other people become defined by their relationship to your chosenness. Are they an ally, an enemy, a convert? This is always the logic of nationalisms, and few nationalisms today are as explicit and influential as the United States of America, who from the very first moment of colonization purposed themselves, imagined themselves in the majority as possessing some great cosmic importance. In calling themselves a new Israel, America has always faced new Canaanites. And today we'll focus on two of those outsiders, Roman Catholics and Native Americans. Because something curious occurred in the 20th century where previous outsiders, like the Catholics, found themselves somewhat included, if not totally absorbed, into the identity of the chosen people of the United States, at least as regards their particular, specifically Catholic identity, while the Native Americans remained on the margins of U.S. self-identity. Today, 2 U.S. presidents have been Catholic, Joe Biden and John Kennedy. The vice president, as I record this in 2025, is Catholic, J.D. Vance. 6 of the presently 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic. Of the 535 members of Congress, presently 150 are Catholic. That's 28%, which overrepresents the Catholic population in the United States, which is about 20%. Catholics have a median household income that just about matches the U.S. average distribution at around $80,000 a year, with white Catholics taking much more of that slice. The average life expectancy of a Catholic in the United States is higher than the average life expectancy of 77 years. In the 2024 election, most Catholics backed the victorious and explicitly self-described nationalist candidate Donald Trump. 61% of white Catholics and 53% of Hispanic Catholics. Meanwhile, there has been no native U.S. president. There has been one native vice president. You've probably never heard of him, Charles Curtis from Kansas of the Kaw Nation under Herbert Hoover. Reached his position significantly by advocating for assimilation practices and the incorporation of independent native nations into the new Western territories. There's never been a justice on the Supreme Court of native origin. In fact, there's never been a federal appellate native judge at all. And only 19 members in all of U.S. history have ever been a part of Congress. There are 4 in the year 2025, 4 present incumbents, which make up 0.7% of Congress, underrepresenting the native population, which is approximately 1 to 2%. Native Americans have a median household income of approximately $60,000, which leaves approximately 1/4 in poverty and varies widely depending on the reservation, which some even reach 50% poverty rate, lower than the American average. Their life expectancy is much lower than the average 77 years, instead around 65 to 70 years. And in the 2024 elections, natives faced difficulty in ballot access, little outreach from candidates, and supported the less explicitly nationalist, though certainly still nationalist in rhetoric, candidate Kamala Harris at 57%. Catholics have entered into American national self-identity quite successfully, and Native Americans have not. Through these 2 experiences, we will explore the religious nationalism of the United States, which considers itself a subject of cosmically religious importance. That is, it is a theological subject requiring theological diagnosis. We will find that Catholics were more able to and more willing to participate in 3 recurring motifs of nationalism. 1, identity in race and religion. 2, interpreted experiences of covenantal blessing. And 3, a teleological mission towards world salvation. We start then with the tripartite logic of religious nationalism. So what makes a Messiah? What makes a chosen people? Fundamental to the nationalist identity is race and religion. Though not yet regarding a nation, the earliest days of the Massachusetts Bay Colony under John Winthrop hoped for a pure Protestant community whose divine example would shine forth. Such an identity was eventually maintained not merely through piety, but through one's genetic line. Agreements like the Halfway Covenant in 1662 allowed non-observant children of the baptized to be baptized too and receive political rights in the community, though not communion. Sack van Berkovich, the famed scholar of Puritanism, notes how this radically expanded the concept of what constitutes a legitimate community in New England by detaching political life from traditional religious observance, making a new kind of space where something different, a religious politics, could develop. Scholar of African American studies Eddie Glaude notes how firmly Protestantism was woven with Anglo-Saxon identity in America's colonists. The Constitution demonstrated this. The founders' freedom was compatible with unique ruling rights to propertied, white, and mostly Anglo-Saxon Protestants and deists, now quite far from rigorous Puritanism. 3 Catholics were founders, but the breadth of U.S. expansion was fueled by an explicit Protestantism. The, quote, advance guard of civilization owed a Anglo-Saxon manifest destiny. So wrote John O'Sullivan, a famous and influential journalist in the, when was that? The 1800s, specifically 1845. As Princeton's scholar Harry Stout argues, the Civil War could rightly be cast as a competition to be the firstborn of this fused ratio-religious identity, which granted a national legitimacy. Those who won were those now imbued with the religious energy to continue the American project. By century's turn, prominent politician Albert Beveridge summarized it this way, quote, the European and Teutonic peoples were those to whom God had given the antipodes to develop their resources, regenerate their people, and establish civilization. Unquote. In this way, the white nation was alone granted by God the capacity of self-governance. In this way, as some have argued, whiteness is more an epistemology of power relation than an identity. And it is this understanding of relation to power in one's ethnic and religious identity that manifests the sense of chosenness, permits one to be a part of the chosen people. Second, nationalism grows by a unique perception of one's own experience. Winthrop's special covenant with God had been stamped by their safe oceanic passage from the too Catholic Anglican Great Britain. Revolutionary success had made Washington a Moses, and the steady advance of industrial capitalism feeding on the near infinite conquered land and resources of the New World, so-called, lent a sense of the United States as being divinely blessed, in Berkovich's words, a utopian source of radical potential. White Protestant U.S. history was a starring role at the fulcrum of a cosmic story that united heaven and earth. Even failures were subsumed by the process of Jeremiatic lament. All critiques always, only, ever urged a chosen people to return to their covenant, where for Berkovich, quote, in all cases, the idea of American Revolution ruled out any basic challenge to the system. The summons to dissent, because it was grounded in a prescribed ritual form, preempted the threat of radical alternatives. Conflict itself was rendered a mode of control, unquote. If you wanted to make change in the United States, and as with all things, the United States changes, You had to appeal to and anchor it in the story of America's destiny. If you did not, you would not have a voice. The most you could say is not that we have done wrong, but that we have failed to live up to our responsibility. The Constitution was heralded by those observing it as the progress of mankind, the heiress of the civilized world's blood, experience, and wisdom. So wrote the famed contemporary preacher Lyman Beecher of the famous Beecher family, who declared also that God, quote, had brought our fathers to this godly land to lay the foundations of religious liberty and wrought such wonders in their preservation and raised their descendants to such great heights of civil and religious prosperity, unquote. And he further notes that nowhere does wealth so directly point towards virtue and morality and spirituality than in the religion of America. For Abraham Lincoln, despite chaos and collapse to the contrary, the U.S. was understood as the last best hope of earth, a line that would be repeated ad infinitum by those who followed him. As Stout argues astutely, the blood sacrifice of the Civil War became a sort of propitiation, a divine sacrifice necessary for America to feel its nationalism. That is, to transform a loose collection of states into one block of messianic identity. America's covenantal identity was inscribed on its motto, on its coins, in its speeches, in its rituals, in its ceremonies, from Eisenhower's "In God We Trust" to Biden's sacred documents. America interpreted all of its success not as historical contingency, but as divine revelation for what Reagan redeclared would be our city upon a hill. American capitalism, American military might, was the new divine revelation upon the earth, showing who truly God's chosen people were. Third, nationalism possesses a certain sacred mission, a teleology, an aim, a goal. Berkovich insists that the American imagination believed the divine had set themselves toward nothing less than the cosmic and redemptive mission for the world. Jonathan Edwards and Cotton Mather's, famous preachers of early America, saw an eschatological Christian millennium that would emerge from the United States, the work of the United States. While Samuel Langdon preached the, quote, the great events in God's moral government designed from eternal ages to be displayed in these ends of the earth, unquote. Now free, as famous preacher Ezra Stiles wrote, from the burden of vice in Europe. To overthrow kings and to carry on a new order of civilization into all the fallen corners of the globe, nothing less became the calling of the United States from war to war. American purpose was benevolent rulership, declared Senator Beveridge, to rescue the world from its, quote, natural wilderness and from savage men, to work out the salvation of these lesser peoples. Planetary order was to be our inheritance, from Wilson to Kennedy to Nixon to Bush to Obama to Trump. The lyrics certainly differed according to time and place, but all harmonized to a similar underlying beat, that Providence intended an infinitely enduring United States to save the future from chaos. American children hear it every morning when the earliest and most common association of the word God meets them in a context of the Pledge of Allegiance. In the words of the remarkable combination of Ronald Reagan in 1974 with Pius XII in 1948, into the hands of America, God placed the destinies of an afflicted mankind, unquote. So if these 3 points make for a Messiah, make for a chosen people, a certain kind of ethnic religious identity, a certain kind of interpretation of one's experiences as divinely blessed, and a certain particular aim and purpose to somehow save the world for some great good. What makes for an anti-Messiah? What was it that put Catholics and Native Americans originally outside of that story? Nationalism could be called a theology of one's own people as ultimate reality. As Vine Deloria Jr., native Sioux theologian and historian, recognizes, to dispute any of these points, hierarchical identity, the experience of economic and military success, the mission of imperial extension, puts one somewhere between potential convert and threat by putting nationalism under the judgment of a standard that is not of its own mythology. Roman Catholics and Native Americans have each played this outsider role, twin enemies that have been tied up together since the French, the Catholic and Indian War. One of the earliest events that solidified an American identity that was apart from Britain. One represents the threat of monarchical oppression, and the other the threat of supposed savage barbarity. So let us examine both in order. See, New England's Puritan settlers perceived themselves as refugees from Britain's religious civil wars. They were expulsed in order to found their city on a hill as a common front against global Catholicism, so writes Princeton historian Daniel Rogers. Catholicism was an anathema identity, as Winthrop's colony termed themselves Solomon, vis-a-vis their own Queen of Sheba, who were visitors from Catholic Acadia. To Jonathan Edwards, Roman Catholicism was the ecclesiastical pride of the splendid European hierarchies. A world, he says, that's dying so that a new messianic world could be born in North America. This religious identity, of course, was also intertwined with race, because white meant preeminently Anglo-Saxon. The Irish, the Spanish, the Italian, the Polish. These races tended towards, quote, bending the knee to foreign idolatry, false tastes, false doctrines, false principles. So wrote the famed columnist John O'Sullivan, the Confederate who coined the phrase of American nationalism, manifest destiny. As immigrants poured into the United States, preacher Lyman Beecher feared that the, quote, street sweepings and prison houses of Europe would emerge into this messianic project and, quote, be unaccustomed to self-government, inaccessible to education, and easily accessible to prepossession, and inveterate credulity and intrigue, and easily embodied and wielded by sinister design. Clearly, such language about migrants is neither new or astonishing today. It is well tread in the annals of Christian American nationalism. Whether it is some terrifying globalists today or the papacy in Rome pulling the strings of these migrants, Catholic pseudo-racial identity in the United States was subjected to marginalization, dehumanization, and often violence across centuries of immigration. Second, if America's experience was of being uniquely chosen, a uniquely blessed, a uniquely guided people, well, then a transnational church that made nearly the precise claim for itself would be of ultimate threat. In the words of Thomas Paine, quote, monarchy is the popery of government. If the U.S. was meant to have universal oversight and extension of democratic liberty to protect all those backwards people of the earth, then Catholicism could only represent, quote, the Luciferian chaos of the old world, as Berkovich puts it. Amidst the expansions of the 1830s arose the worry that, quote, a dark-minded population, a hive of clouds like locusts rising and going to settle, would turn the light of the United States into a hopeless primeval darkness. Artwork commonly portrayed Catholic immigrants as animalistic crocodiles, apes, pigs, thin veneers through which the papal powers might snatch the operating levers of the world's new Messiah. With so much at stake, nationalism was deployed to take them, quote, under our schools and institutions and various powers of assimilation, or else, quote, they might be punished by disenfranchisement and death. So wrote Lyman Beecher, one of the most famous abolitionist clergymen of the 19th century. Now to the other half of our story. Native Americans from the start were given the typology of the Canaanites who surrounded and threatened God's new people with their pagan ways. As religion scholar Lee Irwin notes, Native Americans held their own ancient customs, they had their own divine parentage, their own distinct spiritual life, with ever-present practice that imbued all of life. And generally, they resisted and resented assimilation. As Vine Deloria notes, there was no theological space for alternatives. At best, the natives were simply tools being used by God for the colonists' blessing, with no inherent purpose of their own. Irwin observes that the typical perception of a distinctly native identity by American Protestants was as of a lying laziness, indulging of the children, not emphasizing the family, and having no government. As Cherokee mixed-race minister William Appice observed in the 1830s, the Protestant religion and native religion shared mutually the racial character of its adherents. As if the white race and religion alone could be intelligent and peaceful, Deloria declares, so could the red man be only lesser and wretched. Further, the natives' very presence upon the land of North America was a living threat to the American nationalisms. They existed before the colonists, prior to the divine mandate, outside of the myth. Simultaneously, then, they functioned as a foil that American nationalism grew against. The native presence permitted the earliest colonists to conceive of themselves as what Columbia historian Anders Stevenson likens to, quote, Abraham among the Sodomites, a Joshua among Canaan, or Jacob and Laban. In the very act of being challenged by the natives, American messianism bolstered itself by interpreting the outbreaks of diseases and sickness among the natives, or their economic, geographic, and cultural subjugation, as divine judgment and their own chosen preservation. And so Deloria quotes from colonial military leadership that, quote, sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents to create what Irwin called a clean slate for the millennial kingdom. Despite being the very cause of colonial survival, Princeton historian Kevin Cruz notes that the natives were ever derided by capitalistic messianism as living a, quote, non-competitive life, failing to rule the land of North America in a sufficiently useful way. This justified their physical expunging by broken treaties, coercive threats, and the all-consuming violence of manifest destiny, so that the chosen people might receive their chosen land, their Lebensraum, their Zion, their greater America. Natives were made the subject of processes of assimilation, missionizing, restrictions to their rights of movement, criminalization of their culture and religion, massive and unrestricted violence. If assimilation was not accepted, then only the trail of tears, forced starvation, wounded knee, and the total war tactics of the postbellum era were offered. By 1890, celebrated author L. Frank Baum of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz fame wrote in favor of genocide, with safety depending upon, quote, the total extermination of the Indians. We had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow up wrong by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. Unquote. Just as language about migrants is not new to the American story of nationalism, neither is the claim that groups living in their historic homes must be violently cleansed. So whereas Catholics presented a global counter-narrative to U.S. chosen messianism, the Native American presented a local counter-narrative, both dire threats. So if we've been able to discuss what makes for a Messiah and a chosen people, and what makes for an unchosen oppositional people, how does one become the other? We must ask, what changed that allowed Catholics increasing participation in American messianic identity in the latter half of the 20th century? First, their racial identity had begun to resolve itself. The European Catholic increasingly came to pass as white, especially as the most essential boundary between white and black became sharper with the rumbling of civil rights. Whiteness required reinforcements to maintain hegemony and offered others new buy-in, a social status deal that welcomed many of the previously outcast, new benefits handed over and against black Americans in the U.S. racial hierarchy. A similar exchange occurred in religious identity. As the 20th century, Catholicism began to accept the rationality of a pluralistic society and freedom of religion, beliefs which culminated in Vatican II. No longer mutually incompatible with a project of modernity like the United States, Catholics could find common ground with Protestant democracy. Simultaneously, from the side of Protestant nationalism, American religion came more and more to be a coalition of any deeply held religious faith, a sort of modern development of the halfway covenant, any religious aspect with a Judeo-Christian core. In order to shore up the American capitalist democratic identity vis-a-vis the new great global enemy of Soviet materialistic socialism, and thus come together the unlikely figures of Ronald Reagan and Pius XII, who both believed in America because they understood the Soviets to be a graver threat than any social or material ill of the United States and its capitalist individualism. The American melting pot melted even religious differences down, orienting them more and more towards the United States itself as a shared religious object, served by what the Supreme Court has called a pious ceremonial deism, the language of American religious nationalism. Nowhere is this more obvious or more effective, religion scholar Jonathan Ebel argues, than in Catholic participation in the sacralization of American wars. The Civil War and World War I especially served to show the Catholic dedication to American myth-making, first as local, then as global savior. In fighting the Great War, Catholic Americans showed they were not loyal to old Europe and its monarchies, but rather made the messianic cause of America its own, their own. By 1900, starting in Maryland, Catholic parishes segregated for the first time, accommodating the American story that some, the white, were being welcomed into. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected, having openly renounced papal allegiance and affirming his attention was only for the, quote, national interest and without regard to outside religious pressures or dictates, in order to oppose the spread of communist influence, he says. By the 1970s, Irish Catholics in Boston were rioting against desegregating busings. Perhaps more than any other factor, it was the growth of shared common enemies, atheistic liberalism, black civil rights in the late 20th century, the cultural overthrow of a conservative social ethic, the state capitalist communism threat in the Soviet Union, all of which threatened America's hierarchical, divine, capitalist, imperial, white, Protestant story. The Catholics could be brought together with Protestants. That is, capitalism required a broader base of support, and so elevated new groups from the extracted margins and turned them into beneficiaries, at least relatively so. Popular personalities like Bishop Fulton Sheen used anti-communism as a vehicle of inclusion to adapt Catholicism to American needs, selling the American way of life as scholar of religion Mark Massa at Boston College argues, as the real religion of the world, the gospel of capitalistic, civil, and religious individuality. However, on the other hand, therefore, by their very existence, Vine Deloria argues, natives violate this basic reality, unquote. Every bridge that American Catholics could pass over and join with the sacralized Anglo-Saxon majority, the Native Americans either generally refused or were denied. It was quite impossible for most natives to ever pass as white, and if lesser whites like the Irish and Italians only passed by the slightest of margins to bolster capitalism's ranks, to bolster the ranks of American nationalism, how much more would the native or black human stand forever outside of the Anglo-Saxon definition? Further, unlike the Protestant Catholic, the Protestant native had not even a shared metaphysic. From the earliest engagements, native prophets like Neolin of the Delaware Lenni Lenape had insisted that their ways required an intense distinction from the ways of invasive Europe. They could not make one earth of two, for America's earth was a resource to be subdued and ruled, while the native earth was a living entity that could not be bought and sold. As Deloria argues, the extinguishing of native belief and ritual and practice was precisely required by the ruling nationalism and its mythic aims. To this day, the lot left to the native has been ever diminishment of reservations that of which no less than Adolf Hitler himself could praise as having gunned down millions to a few 100,000 and now kept the modest remnant under observation in a cage, unquote. This is not to say that there were not many attempts to bridge this gap by many native Christians. For example, such was the Cherokee Elias Boudinot, who preached a future in which the native might, quote, save and complete her civilization, recognize its shortcomings, and, quote, be admitted into all the privileges of the American family, which grows brighter and brighter until it reaches the fullness of glory, a faithful ally of the United States, unquote. That is, Boudinot hoped for precisely what Catholics received in the late 20th century, despite that his intermarriage with the daughter of a rich white family of Connecticut brought about local protests and the closure of their missionary school. Boudinot still hoped assimilation could save his people. In the face of Andrew Jackson ignoring the Supreme Court's defense of native land rights in Georgia, Boudinot represented a minority Cherokee faction that negotiated an 1835 treaty to cede all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi to the United States. This treaty became the basis for the violent enforcement of the Trail of Tears. And Boudinot himself was assassinated in 1839 by Cherokee of the majority party. His work neither stopped the expansion demanded by American nationalist fervor, nor convinced his fellow natives. Instead arose what he wrote of as a very melancholy, mournful precedent that native peoples will pass away until only a few solitary creatures are left to tell the sad story of extinction, unquote. Nearly all such attempts at assimilation, from coercively destroying native culture and language by mandating violent and abusive boarding schools, to legal restrictions on linguistic, physical, and religious expression of native culture, all had to be done at the barrel of a gun, bringing about generations of trauma. No common enemy arose, for the native was the common enemy of the nationalist project of the United States down to the present day. As Chief Seattle of the Suquamish is cited of saying in 1854, quote, day and night cannot dwell together. We are two distinct races with separate origins and separate ends. With the ingredients of nationalism's religious mythos understood as identity, experience, and mission, we can see that such a cosmic identity, given state power of violence, demands either assimilation or conquest. There's no reality possible when the stakes have been understood as nothing less than universal cosmic salvation. I will interject here and say that I, alongside my Anabaptist colleagues, would argue that the only cosmic story, identity, and mission that can be believed without these consequences must have a base in nonviolence and self-giving love, which can resist the impetus of conquest and exploitation. I step back. American Catholicism was able to navigate a way into this chosen identity of America. White enough, metaphysically similar enough, beneficiaries enough of American war and profit, with common enough enemies. Thus, Ebel rightly notes that American messianism can accommodate, as with any of the most effective historic empires, which called themselves divinely ordained, quote, a pantheon of vassal deities, so long as ultimate sovereignty belongs to the nation, unquote. But natives could not pass for Anglo-Saxon. Their religion was founded on a radically different metaphysic than most of 16th to 19th century Protestantism, and they could rarely sacralize the American experience of war and prosperity, for they themselves were most often the cost. Their communal religion hardly even matched the individual religiosity that the Bill of Rights had in mind. The Native Americans stood as the antithesis of sacralized American history. Their presence both a spiritual and physical, literal counterclaim from outside of the mythology of nationalism. This continues today. President Biden, a Catholic, followed Pope Francis in offering a historic formal apology for the viciousness of native boarding schools, an overdue act, but one which he still couched in Jeremiatic terms, noting in the very same speech that the U.S. is the greatest nation for recognizing this history, and so shows a deeper level of who we are beyond the strict historical reality. Notice how he couches the apology not in terms of a critique of the United States generally, but as a failure for us to live up to our actual, still true, messianic potential. He also canceled controversial tribal concerns, such as the Keystone XL pipeline, but he supported others, like at Mountain Valley and oil sands, against tribal will. Meanwhile, President Trump, a Protestant, is trying to unilaterally end birthright citizenship, using a pillar from the 1884 Supreme Court decision that excluded natives from citizenship until 1924. His tribal recognitions appear whimsical and selective. His funding freezes reveal how dependent native communities are upon federal support, and few presidents could beat his rapacious hunger for massive resource extraction in the name of America First nationalism that now stretches in the projections of President Trump from Greenland to Panama, which are incidentally the same boundaries that the original coiners of the term manifest destiny had understood to be divinely appointed by God to America. These are not new realities. President Biden's language of referring to the founding documents as sacred documents is quite in line with all of his predecessors in the same sort of civil religious seed that blossoms into full-throated nationalism in the form of presidents such as Donald Trump. Much of the confusion and tumult of the present political moment in 2025 of the United States can be rendered sensible when understood as the culmination and result of a messianic story that the United States has never been without. When Elon Musk absurdly claimed that the West is uniquely empathetic and ought to be less so as not to be taken advantage of, we must also hear in that the smothering of empathy that is the natural development and an incipient reality to every stage of the American story. As nationalisms become more and more desperately jingoistic, lacking external foes and facing internal contradictions, which groups will be returned with prior prestige will be returned to common cog scapegoats so that a greater rate of profit might be extracted? Who has been welcomed in as a beneficiary from the outside who is soon to be rejected as another scapegoat to keep the nationalist project together. I suggest we are seeing this reality play out presently before us. Many angles here remain yet to be explored. It is regrettable we have not the time to also examine the African American experience, as they stand presently in a sort of lower middle ground between where we see Catholics and natives. What will be required of them, who already must manage a double belonging or a triple belonging for the Black, American, and Catholic? What will be required of them for full inclusion in the American nationalist story? Assimilation or reformation? Or Hispanic Americans? How will the story of migration, those now called roaches who poison the blood of the nation by President Trump, how will their stories impact the possibility and meaning of the nationalist story of the United States? Recent elections demonstrate small but not insignificant movement away from the implicit nationalism of the Democratic Party and towards the far more explicit nationalism of the Republican Party. Will these new entries find a steady home there? Or will they only be used and discarded in a short-term attempt to return to some purer nationalism of the past? I think of Sister Geraldine Clifford, a Lakota-born sister of St. Francis, who wrote openly of her struggle with her dual identity, that what had once been naturally spiritual within her had been killed, surrendered, so that her people could, quote, live in the white man's world. Yet she saw no inherent conflict between true Lakota and true Catholic. It was in part Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae 60 years ago at Vatican II that opened Catholicism's meta-narrative to the point where its American contingent could identify as an American story perhaps more than as a Catholic one. Yet it is also these documents which argued that people ought to, quote, extend their thoughts and their spirit beyond the confines of their own nation, that they put aside national selfishness and ambition to dominate other nations, and that they nourish a profound reverence for the whole of humanity. Amidst so many excluded, can we refuse a story that demands domineering identity, ahistorical self-deification, a mission to cosmic rulership, all based on temporary and invisible boundaries drawn across land? Can we seek wider, more challenging narratives based on class or common humanity, like that of St. Paul, whose theology, I would argue, understood the whole human race to be chosen and the earth to be the single holy land? Or shall we cling to the identities that make us incompatible to acknowledging our shared and interdependent existence? To this end, we cannot stop theologically questioning our narratival identity, our interpretation of historic experience, and our purpose and mission in the world. It was precisely this which concerned those Anabaptists who also meet a 500th anniversary this year, when they met at Schleitheim, writing against oaths of allegiance, writing against stately violence, and all those things, quote, which are highly regarded by the world and yet are carried on in flat contradiction to the command of God. What will happen when we question our nationalist story, when we question the reality of being chosen, when we interrogate the ingredients that have gone on and into making that story? What will that look like today? We've seen where it has led for the Roman Catholic and for the native. Where will it lead us next? I leave you with that very question.